The ship's company knew that they just had to do a job, and whatever you were sort of thinking in the back of your mind about the rights and the wrongs of what's going on, we just had to put all of that aside. If we had not located that vessel, everyone on board that ship would have perished, I'm sure of it.
Welcome to the podcast where we track down Australian war veterans, have a chat with them, and hear their stories. I'm Alex Lloyd, and this is Life on the Line.
The single greatest sacrifice I've made is my family.
We weren't out there to take country, we were out there to do something. That was our job.
I did feel a lot of regret.
Friends were still getting killed.
It got to the point where, you're going to funerals quite often.
Do I lead under fire?
And that was a heavy responsibility, I guess, on my shoulders that I didn't want to screw up.
You have to be resilient to get a cope.
War itself is horrific. It's a horror story. It should never be dressed up as if it's something glorious.
Not what you can do for yourself, but what can you do for your country.
The volunteer for service was in effect to put your life on the line.
Welcome to the Season 5 finale of Life on the Line. Today's episode is with Kasey Mumford. Kasey was an officer in the Royal Australian Navy. She deployed to Timor, the Arabian Gulf, and was on HMAS Manoora during the MV Tampa incident in 2001. This is our conversation. I'm Alex Lloyd, speaking today with Kasey Mumford. Kasey, welcome to Life on the Line.
Thanks for having me, Alex.
Kasey, where were you born? Where did you grow up?
I was born in Darwin in the Northern Territory, but I mostly grew up in Canberra in the ACT. So my father was in the Navy, so that I spent the first half a dozen years of my life moving around. We lived in Darwin a couple of times. We also lived in Victoria for a little while, and then my parents finally settled in Canberra about the same time that my brother and I were starting primary school. That coincided with the time that Dad was leaving the Navy, so they bought our first home there, and that's where we finished our schooling off. Was joining the Navy or the military a first in your father's generation, or was there a family tradition going further back than that? My mother's side of the family immigrated from Poland after the Second World War, so my grandfather was in the Polish army as well. But other than that, no, Dad was really the first to join up. Well, I suppose, though, with that ancestry where war was quite a fact of life, and then your father's service, was it kind of normalised then for you, the concept of military and service? It wasn't that foreign to you, it was just immediate and everyday life. Yeah, exactly. And always felt very comfortable with it as well. And I think that was because of the exposure that I had because of Dad. Then in high school, when I was looking at different career options, joining the Navy was always something that was on the table for me. I did my Year 10 work experience with the Navy. My father also organised for me to spend some time with a midshipman who was studying at ADFA, just so I could get an idea of, what her career path looked like and what a day in the life of a cadet at ADFA was like too. When I finished Year 12, I didn't actually join the Navy. I took up an option to study at the Australian National University. I lasted about 6 months there before I realised I'd made the wrong decision and went straight into a Defence Force recruitment office and said, I want to join the Navy and go and study through ADFA. Before we jump from ANU to ADFA, did you ever get a chance to speak with your grandparents about the Second World War? I didn't get to speak to my grandfather a lot about it. He passed away when I was in primary school, but my grandmother, she passed away last year actually. I used to speak to her a lot about it, and she would sort of tell us about playing in the forest when the German bombers were coming over into Poland. She told us about how she used to babysit some Jewish children in families, and then she said after the Germans had invaded Poland, she went back to visit these families and they just disappeared. And she also told us about when they were all rounded up and they all got put into a working camp and what the conditions were like in the working camp. So yeah, I did talk to her a lot about her life in Europe during the Second World War. It was just fascinating. Because it's a completely different world than when you're marching into ADFA as a cadet, and thankfully a much happier and safer world. But I guess still that's got to be in the back of the mind somewhere that, these are the frontline realities of what can end up occurring. Or was it actually just you were more looking to your dad and love of the sea and love of the idea of Navy? What was the sort of big draw card for you ultimately? I think it was more the adventure and being at sea and the travel for me. So when I reflected on my childhood a little bit, it does have a pretty strong maritime flavour to it. So my dad has always loved fishing. We've always had boats in our family. So I remember even in primary school sitting out in the boat with him, and he was teaching me Morse code. And I can also remember, he would point out the navigation markers when we were travelling along in the boat going to our next fishing spot. So it does have this, I guess, this strong maritime flavour. And then also some of his behaviours that sort of carried on after he'd left the Navy too. It was something that seemed quite familiar, and I was quite comfortable with. Yeah, it was something I always thought I think this would be a really good thing to do.
Well, you do it. How did you find ADFA versus ANU? More to your liking and more to your style?
I did like the structure a lot. So I found going from, I went to an all-girls Catholic school. So I found going from that environment to ANU, I just felt like it was, like my whole world had opened up really, really quickly. So when I went to ADFA, I did feel like there was a little bit more scrutiny and a little bit more accountability around my studies. So I think that was really good for me. But, ADFA in the 90s, as you probably have learnt from some of the other guests, could be quite a merciless place as well. So I'm fully aware that not everyone had a positive experience there. I really enjoyed it. I had a lot of fun and formed, lifelong friendships at ADFA.
That's great. And then after your 3 years at ADFA, you go on to the Seaman Office Application course.
So that's the professional training course for seaman officers in the Navy. It's probably called something else now. But essentially, there's 4 phases of training, and it's a mixture of classroom training and then training at sea. I took up an option when I was in third year at the Australian Defence Force Academy to start phase 1 of my Seaman Officer application course concurrent with my third year studies. So when I finished at ADFA at the end of 1999, I went straight to sea in HMAS Tobruk, and that was for phase 2 of my training. That's a 3-month phase at sea. We went to East Timor and Bougainville, but just in a logistics support capacity. So they were very quick trips. And then we went to Norfolk Island and New Zealand and then came home. Then phase 3 of the training is a navigation watch-keeping component of training. So once again, there's another classroom component. And then I went to sea in the survey motor launches. So I posted to HMAS Benalla in Cairns. While I was there, Benalla went into quite an extensive refit, which meant I was going to be ashore for my commanding officer thought too long and wasn't getting enough experience at sea. So he organised for me to augment the bridge team of HMAS Mermaid, and I went back to East Timor in HMAS Mermaid.
It's very practical for the Navy officers then. You're getting to Timor, to Bougainville, and you're at sea as part of your learning, which is a great way to get stuck into that. I mean, that must have just been so exhilarating to be at sea so quickly, and you're learning, but you're also doing the work.
That's something I also reflect on as well, and I think especially in boats, servo motor launches and patrol boats, because the ship's company is quite small, you're automatically included in whatever is going on because you're a valuable resource on board that boat. So it was a great experience, not only for me in a professional sense as a seaman officer, but you kind of forced to learn the jobs of other people as well. So, for example, when our radio operator was not available, but there had to be signals loaded, I'd have to go into the comm center and download the signals. Or if we came across another warship at sea, the protocol is to exchange IDs with that warship. So I was on the flashing light exchanging IDs. I was in the cable locker, I think, at one stage as well, because we had some people ashore and we had to go to anchor. So I just jumped into the cable locker to, assist the ship to go to anchor. So there I was as a young midshipman, just jumping in and doing whatever had to be done. And that's just the way it goes on those ships.
And when you're on HMAS Mermaid and back in East Timor, I understand that some of the local kids were interested in what you guys were up to.
So we were doing collecting survey data in East Timor to update the navigation charts, which had become, quite out of date. So we were not only collecting that survey data at sea by doing depth soundings and that sort of thing, but we were actually ashore as well, positioning conspicuous objects, coastlining. I did a tide camp, those sorts of things. And whenever I was off the boat and trudging around, I just had this entourage of village children that used to follow me wherever I went. And I think they just wanted to be involved. They were very curious. So I just used to let them carry things for me. It didn't occur to me at the time, I guess, that, if they legged it, I would have lost my GPS, my spare batteries, my water, the radio back to the ship, everything. But thankfully, they stayed around and they just wanted to help. So I just used to give them things and say, okay, well, you can carry this and we're going up that hill, let's go. Yeah, but inevitably, there was always one that would pull out a machete, and that was generally one of the children that I didn't give a task to. And I realised pretty quickly that he thought he could help by clearing a path for me. So he would use this machete to clear the path for me. So that was fine. I never felt like I was in danger or anything like that.
Fails a few OH&S and working with children standards in Australia, but we'll move past that. Your phase 4 and consolidation, and again, you're still in your training phase here, is on HMAS Manoora. And before we get to what Manoora is known for in 2001, just tell me a bit about this ship and some of the work you're doing on it, and when you join, what you're expecting the ship to be up to.
I joined Manoora in the July of 2001, straight off the bridge simulator, and I was there to get my bridge warfare certificate. So it was the final stage of my training. Manoora and Canimbla had traditionally been heavily relied upon. They were Australia's amphibious capability at the time. They worked a lot in a tri-service exercise environment and were also called upon to respond to any local geopolitical emergencies, so peacekeeping in the Solomon Islands and that sort of thing. So my expectation was that I would be engaged in that sort of work. However, when I joined Manoora, she had been scheduled to undertake a diplomatic trip to Southeast Asia, taking in 4 ports: Manila in the Philippines, Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam, Bangkok in Thailand, and then Penang in Malaysia. So when I joined the ship, there was a real buzz on board. People were really excited because they were actually doing something that was completely different to what they had been doing previously.
And then Manoora becomes involved in the infamous Tampa affair, as it's known. And avid listeners of this podcast who heard number 114, Bruce McLennan, have already heard the perspective of the Special Air Service Regiment that were utilised to seize the vessel, take initial control, and provide that very first initial point of care to the asylum seekers. Kasey, can you run us through your perspective on what happens in the Tampa affair from Manoora?
The first time I realised that we weren't going to be making it into Bangkok was I had an understanding of what the ocean passage plan, the navigation plan looked like. And I just remember this night, the ship made a huge turn that was unexpected. And I was waiting actually for a man overboard pipe, and it didn't come. So when I got up to go and watch, the navigator was up frantically drawing up charts, and I noted that we were fixing the ship through the Indonesian archipelago. And I said to the navigator, "What's going on?" And he said, "We've got to go to Christmas Island. We've been asked to assist with an incident." The picture was something that just evolved over time. The communication systems on board ships were not the same as they are now. We didn't have Skype or, all of these different ways of communicating with our families. We just had emails, and actually our emails were disconnected as well for operational reasons. So it wasn't that easy to, get information about what was going on. So I guess the penny didn't really drop for me until we started loading a lot of humanitarian stores on board. So a lot of stretchers, and it was really little things like baby formula, seeing baby formula being brought on board, that really struck me. And I thought, we're dealing with very vulnerable people, with families, probably with people who are sick, pregnant women, that sort of thing. So that's when it really hit home for me, what was unfolding. And also by that stage, I think we all had a fairly clear picture of just how politically sensitive the issue was too for the Howard government. When we first sighted the Tampa, it was kind of hard to see the number of people that were on board the Tampa. But But it was when we started doing these boat transfers and they just kept coming and coming and coming. And then I remember I went down to the tank deck and the entire tank deck was just full of stretchers. And then once we had embarked the security element and additional personnel plus all of the asylum seekers, our ship's company had swollen to about 800. So it became a real logistical challenge to support these people and keep them safe while we worked out exactly what was going on. Because at that stage, we didn't even know where we were going. When I had a look back through the ship's logs more recently, it had that we were transiting to Port Moresby. So there was a lot of confusion and uncertainty about where we were going. And I also recall we did a replenishment sea with HMAS West Australia, and our RAS breakaway song was Road to Nowhere by Talking Heads.
So you take on board the 430 or so mostly Afghan asylum seekers, and there's another wave of those, which we'll get to in a moment. But you take on these asylum seekers, and as you say, it's a politically sensitive issue for the government at the time. It's a politically divisive issue today in how various governments have handled asylum seekers. But I suppose whatever one thinks of the politics or what our preferred border policy, etc., should be, it doesn't change the fact that you're there seeing the human face of that. It's not a grainy image on the television or just a statistic in a newspaper column. That is a bunch of people right there, mothers with children, etc., as you were outlining. You've not even completed your training then. That's must have been very confronting, not just for you, but for everyone on board. I guess, can you paint a bit more of the human picture you were faced with, as well as the logistics of, yes, how do we fit this many people safely on the ship and that kind of thing, down to just that actually interacting with them and dealing with them?
It was a very morally complex situation, and there were, I'm sure a range of views on board amongst the ship's company about, whether we should be doing more or doing less and everything in between. And I still notice now, whenever the topic of Tampa is raised amongst members of the ship's company at the time, it's highly emotive too. People were genuinely wrestling with being morally challenged by what was happening. But at the end of the day, I think we all knew that we had to do a job, and we had to do it professionally and sensitively, and that it had to be in alignment with the national interests as well. But yeah, in terms of that human face, it was really confronting. It was, a lot of people as well, we're talking about 2001, didn't have that cultural exposure as well. Seeing, that there was a bit of a pecking order amongst men and women and children, that was all very visible to people. And I know that, for example, some of the sailors used to play soccer on the upper deck with the kids, and try and keep them entertained and things like that. So yeah, I think overall the ship's company knew that they just had to do a job, and whatever you were sort of thinking in the back of your mind about the rights and the wrongs of what's going on, we just had to put all of that aside.
Well, that's the mark of a professional military member, in that you are not the policy creators, nor should you be. You are fulfilling the mandate and the mission of the day, and that can be dissected later by the public and the press. That's for there. You have to execute a function. And so whatever people think of they're doing, it's great that you are able to do that, but also find little slithers of human kindness and empathy. The image of, some of our sailors playing soccer with the kids on the deck is a beautiful thing. And it's, I'm sure obviously for the asylum seekers, it would have been an incredibly stressful and challenging period, just, the voyage to Australia, let alone everything else that happens. So, having little moments like that, there'll be little gems that stand out in a difficult period. The challenge is further raised when an extra 230 or so Iraqi asylum seekers are added to the equation. I think that's something that's often overlooked. The Tampa is just the thing that's talked about, but there was actually this whole extra, not insignificant contingent. Can you talk to that?
Yeah, that was, to me, probably more alarming than the Tampa. I remember I was on watch when we first sighted the Ascent. So the Ascent was a barely seaworthy Indonesian fishing boat that was grossly overborne. It had about 230, mostly Iraqi asylum seekers on board, and we located them just off Ashmore Reef in our northern waters. The boat was taking on water. And to this day, if I go to a children's playground and I see something sticky that's been dropped on the ground, like a lollipop or a honey sandwich, piece of honey sandwich, it's just crawling with ants. That is what the superstructure of the Ascent looked like. It was so dangerous. And, that, I guess that was really the time when I started thinking more about, I guess, asking those questions about, people choosing to come to Australia for a better life, but at what cost? What risk are you willing to, or what extent are you willing to go to seek that better life? If we had not located that vessel, everyone on board that ship would have perished, I'm sure of it.
It's not just that Tampa itself is a challenging incident to confront and handle, but it's also the fact that it is a political catalyst, and it's heralded back to 2 decades later. We're still talking about it because it was sort of this real spark, this initial lightning point. And I guess that also keeps bringing it back, and it's not something that's deep in the past in the back of your mind. It keeps being brought up, and I'm, part of the problem there for doing that. Before we finish the story of the Tampa, I guess, how do you just look back and reflect on the coverage, I guess, in the immediate aftermath, and then over the many years, the fact this isn't just a small incident that you can bury in your Navy career, that it's there in such a talking point, and how that marries up with your own memories and perceptions of the events?
Yeah, and it's interesting because it is really a relatively short period of time too. I think that the total time at sea that we were dealing with this was 31 days. So in terms of, a career spanning several years, it's such a short period of time, but my recollections of that event are still so vivid. And I don't think it's anything that will ever leave me or leave anyone who was on board at the time. And you're right, it does come up whenever there's an election. Inevitably, there's something about border politics comes up. I think it's just something that, I don't know, I guess I've just sort of tried to put it aside as being something that happened and something that I know that the ship dealt with very professionally and in a very caring way. And then we really, I guess 9/11 happened as well. So when we were on our way to Nauru, I think we were around the Torres Strait area, 9/11 happened. And that really, I guess, provided an impetus for the government to try and find a solution, get to a conclusion for this, because it wasn't long after that we found out that Manoora would be deploying to the Gulf too. So I think things did move quite quickly past them, but you're right, it's something that does come up all the time.
And at this point, I normally ask what your memory of 9/11 is, because it's something everyone has a vivid memory of because it's 9/11. But then and not much else was happening for our military at the time. But then you're one of the few things that there was something happening. I mean, I'm sure it registered, but what was your perception of 9/11 when you're dealing with this other big thing at the moment? And, your Manora's got its normal complement of 220 has swelled to over 1,000. And at this point, you'll be steaming the refugees to Nauru. So how does 9/11 occur, I guess, from that perspective?
I can remember reading about planes going into the Twin Towers and the other terrorist attacks in the US via a signal. And it was a voluminous signal, pages and pages. And I remember just standing there and I read the whole thing. But because we were at sea and, we didn't have communication available to us, I didn't actually see the footage of 9/11 until October sometime. And I can remember I was at my parents' house and I remember seeing the footage for the first time. And my mum looked at me and she said, "Have you seen this?" And I said, "No." And she said, "This is all we've seen for the last month. It's been such a significant global issue." So really the only exposure that I had to 9/11 was that signal, reading that signal, and then developing that understanding that we needed to go to the Gulf. So we needed to get to an end state with Tampa and then quickly get back to Australia so that we could start working up to an operational level of capability and deploying to the Gulf.
So it's October 2001, you disembarked the asylum seekers, and then January 2002, you are off to the Gulf. What is your mission there?
The UN sanctions against Iraq had been in force since the Iran-Iraq war. So it's been about 11 years for these UN sanctions. So we were going to be relieving other ships that were already there to participate in those sanctions. So we're conducting maritime interception operations, effectively blockading Iraqi territorial waters and with the power, to query ferry and board any vessel that was suspected of smuggling oil or any contraband out of Iraq. We had our own ship's boarding party. We also had a boarding party comprising of members of Australian Clearance Dive Team 4. We had the Commander Task Group embarked, and that was led by Admiral James Goldrick, who held the rank of captain at the time. And he was the Maritime Interception Force commander. And we also had augmented our warfare capability with members of 16 Air Defence, and we had the Navy SEALs embarked too. So we were essentially a launching platform for them to conduct their own operations. So quite a busy ship during that Gulf deployment.
And how did you feel going from, a ship that had been meant to be touring around Asia and having a bit of fun and dealing with that quick refugee crisis to then you're going to the Northern Hemisphere, you're going into what's regarded as a war zone after a cataclysmic event. What were your feelings at the time processing all that?
The seriousness of what I was doing just escalated exponentially. All of a sudden, I wasn't doing my Officer of the Day duties in my whites. I was doing my Officer of the Day duties wearing a Kevlar vest and a helmet and carrying a sidearm. We weren't bringing the ship alongside as we normally would. We had Force Protection Transition Team who were clearing the wharf before we came alongside to make sure, there weren't any explosives or anything like that, because we all had the USS Cole incident where a suicide boat laden with explosives rammed into the side while she was in port in Yemen in 2000. We were going into a very volatile and risky area. We had to transit through contested waters in the Straits of Hormuz. We had the threat of mines. We had chartered mines there. And then it's also a difficult area navigationally because of the shipping. It's, there's a lot of not only the traditional fishing dhows that operate in the area, and they're either very poorly lit or not lit at all, but you've got these tankers and they are absolutely huge. And then also, obviously, operating amongst warships from a lot of different countries. So it's just very busy, very risky and very volatile. The seriousness of that never left me.
And then around 30 boardings are conducted by Manoora, compliant and non-compliant. And I'm not assuming you were sitting back on the bridge having fun while all this occurred, but did you sort of after the fact go, that was a really gratifying, I got to exercise my professionalism, got to do the job for real? Or what was your sort of reflection on that as the deployment unfolded and I guess as you were steaming home?
I felt like I had finally got to do the things that I had trained to do. So, all of the things that we sort of learnt about in our course, it was all put into practice and then some. So I think, in terms of my own growth at that time, it was huge. It was huge professionally and also personally as well. And we did have a situation. So I was awarded my Bridge Warfare Certificate in the April of 2002. And then about a month later, we were actually brought to action stations for real when we were threatened by the Iranian Revolutionary Coast Guard. And that was a really very serious situation. So we were operating probably the furthest north that I can recall. I remember seeing some of the bog hammers, which are basically just small, light, manoeuvrable vessels they have RPGs and they have minimal manning, maybe 2, sometimes 3 people on board. Yeah, I remember seeing a couple of them and then all of a sudden they formed up. So there was this line abreast of about 10 and they started coming towards the ship. Our boarding party were in the water, so we couldn't recover them, which meant that we were undermanned for our weapon systems. And I can recall Commander McIntosh, who was part of the Commander Task Group, he came flying into the bridge and he said, if they come within 2,000 yards, you're to engage them. So we'd gone to action stations. And then my next recollection is looking down onto the forecastle where we had 2 50 cals mounted and there was one able seaman Faulkner manning 2 50 cals. I had someone on the radar calling the Rangers in. We had an interpreter on the radio trying to communicate with them, telling them that, if they came within 2,000 yards, we would open fire on them. It was it really escalated very quickly and it was quite frightening. So we'd left the Gulf and we were coming home via Mauritius. there's fisheries, Australian fisheries. And so the idea was that we were going to be coming home that way, so we could just do a quick patrol through that area to make sure that there was no illegal fishing activity going on. And so it was when we were transiting down the African coast, the swell was beam on for about 5 days. The ship just copped it. I'm normally seasick for about a day. It took me about a day to find my sea legs. And then after that, I wouldn't get sick at all. But I was sick for the entire time that we were transiting to Mauritius. It just couldn't be over fast enough. It was dreadful.
And then also, I think it's on your way home, you find out your next posting. And the fact is that you're going to be posted on a ship that's going back to the Gulf. So you've not even completed your first deployment and you already know you're going back for another one, which many people would say, lucky you.
Always wanted to go to a frigate after Manoora. In fact, I wanted to go to a frigate when I finished phase 4, but got posted to Manoora, so I had to wait. And my navigator had been talking to my poster, and my poster knew what I wanted to do. So he came and saw me when we were on our way home and said, I've got really exciting news. You've been posted to HMAS Newcastle. It's going to be really good for you. You've got a fantastic CO. You're going to have a great time. And so I was really excited, and I said, can we go down to the operations room and print off the fleet activity schedule and have a look at what she's doing? And I think he saw my face just dropped when he gave me the fleet activity schedule, and I realised I was effectively turning around and coming back to the Gulf again.
And how much time did you have between that? Did you get to see family or?
We got back to Australia later in 2002. The first part of 2003 in Newcastle, we ended up doing more border protection work. We had a trip planned that would take us up to Darwin for Anzac Day. And then we had a port visit to Geraldton and Bunbury, and then back to Sydney. But we didn't make it to Geraldton and Bunbury because there were more asylum seeker boats detected in the northern waters. So we ended up stationed off Christmas Island for a little while. And it was actually there that there was a distress call that came in. So we ended up going and performing a rescue on a 7-metre rowboat that had become distressed at sea. There were 2 adventure rowers who, I think they might have been ex-British Gurkhas. They decided they were going to try and row from Carnarvon to La Reunion Island in a 7-metre rowboat. Hit rough weather. One of them sustained a head injury, so they put a distress signal out, and we ended up going and picking them up.
Who foots the bill for a rescue operation like that? Do you invoice them, or how does that work?
Australia has the largest responsible area for search and rescue operations. So I think it's just part of being a great global citizen that, part of being a mariner is helping people who are in peril on the sea. So when you get that distress signal, you go and help people.
And they were in peril because that's something like almost 6,000 kilometres apart they were rowing. So hats off to them. That's impressive. But anyway, you pick them up, and then in July 2003, you're back off to the Warzone. But is it less intimidating this time because you know what you're in for, or because you know what you're in for, your feelings are heightened? What's your reaction going back?
It was a different deployment. So the US had already invaded Iraq by that stage. I think they invaded Iraq in March of 2003, and we left Australia in July of 2003. So our role when we got there was to provide maritime stability. So it was doing the same sort of work, but my recollections are that the tempo wasn't as high as when I was there in Manoora. But I do think, as you pointed to, Alex, that there were a couple of other factors that influenced that. We had quite a number of people on board the ship who had already were coming back for their second trip by that stage, or had even been involved in enforcing UN sanctions previous to 9/11. Definitely a level of familiarity amongst the ship's company with the area that we were operating in and the type of work that we would be doing. Newcastle was also the most senior ship in the fleet. We had Captain Jerry Christian was our CO, and he was just a wonderful CO, really, really competent, a great leader. So I think, that made a huge difference to the ship as well. So I actually got asked by our commanding officer to navigate Newcastle home as well. My navigator at the time, Pete Collins, was going straight on to PILO course. So our CO took him out off the bridge and put him into the operations room. And I was the most senior watchkeeper on board by that stage. So the captain said, do you want to take the ship home? And I said, oh, I would love to.
And this is quite an honour because it's not punching in the address into Google Maps and hitting go. This is, it's a bit more to it than that. Can you allude to some of that?
So I had to do the ocean passage plan. So that's prepare all of the charts, all of the information about where we were going to be, look at all of the weather, our fuel consumption. We came home via India. We had a port visit to Goa in India. We actually pulled into Fremantle in Australia. So it was a matter of getting the ship from the Gulf all the way to Fremantle. And then I had to present that to the CO. So he went through everything. Every single chart, he pulled out every chart. He looked at the courses that I'd plotted. He questioned me about everything. Like, to get him to actually give the nod of approval, it was like a huge project. And then once he had agreed to that, I had to pack up all my belongings and I moved into the chart house in HMAS Newcastle and suddenly realised that I wasn't responsible for my watch anymore. I was responsible for every watch. And we had a communication circuit that came through the chart house called 10MC. And so I had heard, all of the communication going on between the ops room, the bridge, etc. I didn't sleep a lot on the way home, but we got home safely. So it was just a really huge achievement. I was really proud.
You spent the next few years at HMAS Watson and Maritime Headquarters as a course coordinator and in human resource management. Can you sum up those roles and what you were doing, and then I guess how you start to come to the decision perhaps it's time to leave the Navy?
I left Newcastle in January of 2004 and took up a role as the basic navigation course coordinator at HMAS Watson. So I was instructing phase 1 of SEAC, which is, kind of brought me full circle back to where I started. And that was, teaching basic navigation to the junior officers who were graduating from HMAS Creswell and also ADFA. But I also then taught basic navigation to submariners as part of their Petty Officer of the Watch course, and their senior sailors on boats who also stand bridge watches. So I had some groups of the small boats sailors coming through as well, who I taught navigation to. So it was a huge variety of trainees, but it was a really great job. The only thing about that job was the navigation training platform at the time. So I used to take them out to sea for a week after we'd finished the practical work. The navigation training platform was a boat called Seahorse Mercator, which was a Pacific class patrol boat. It was painted blue and yellow. And I used to get horrendously seasick in Mercator as well. And the crew knew, they'd see me getting on board the ship, and the master would come up to me and say, after we get out of Sydney Heads, are we going to Jervis Bay or are we going to Broken Bay? Because he knew I just wouldn't stay out at sea in this thing. Then I went into Fleet Human Resource position at Maritime Headquarters. And then after that, I was due to go back to sea. I actually had a posting to HMAS Ballarat as an APWO and then was supposed to go straight on to PWO course. And I have this very vivid recollection of sitting down with my poster at the time, and he had mapped out the next 15 years of my life in the Navy.
That's confronting for anyone.
It was full on. And I just remember looking at it thinking, you put a lot of effort into this and I'm about to burst your bubble because I'm going to ask some pretty tough questions about family and things like that. But I was already at that stage seeing my husband, and I just couldn't reconcile in my mind how continuing to have a seagoing career was going to work with having a family. And, I'd also sort of started thinking, more deeply about some other experiences that I had and, whether it was really going to be the right thing for me moving forward. And I decided that was probably time for me to move on.
So you get out, get married, raise a family. Can you sum up a bit, I guess, to that life after service experience, what you're doing today? And I understand that your husband was in the Army as well.
Yeah, so my husband was an engineer in the Army and then he went on and studied medicine. I've always felt a really strong connection back to the military. When I left, I spent quite a few years doing reserve time. I did some project work for Navy Health Reserve. I went back and did a couple of stints in defence industry as well. So I've always felt a really strong connection to the military, then I think just through word of mouth, I think military people gravitate towards one another as well. My husband started seeing more and more veterans through our practice, through his practice, general practice, and he found that quite a lot of veterans he was seeing had all sorts of issues, physical injuries and psychological injuries as a result of their service in the military. So he started exploring some options to treat them a little bit differently and started treating them with medicinal cannabis where it was appropriate. So we decided that based on the results that he was getting, that we were going to set up a specific clinic, a medicinal cannabis clinic, where we don't only see veterans, but we are getting more and more veterans coming through the doors. And then also we've moved into a medicinal cannabis supply and manufacture venture called Provocatus, which we've partnered with some other people, and some of them are veterans as well in. So we're really passionate about providing equitable access to people who are looking for, an alternate treatment method, who are suffering chronic pain. And we are finding that it's having really good outcomes on ex-serving members.
That's wonderful to hear, Kasey. And it's been more than a decade since you left. And as you just touched on then, you've always felt a strong connection to the military since. But I guess now you've had a bit more time removed from it. How do you look back on your Navy career as a job and how it grew, challenged and changed you as a person?
I look back so fondly of my time in the Defence Forces, and I often get asked now from some friends whose children are starting to get to, the point where they need to start thinking about their careers, about would I recommend a career in the ADF? And I unreservedly say yes. I don't think there's another profession where from such a young age you can be trusted with to have such a huge level of responsibility and have such incredible experiences. It's not something that you have to do forever, but I certainly think in terms of those experiences, the skills, the things that you learn, the people that you meet, I can't think of another career where you get that sort of exposure.
Kasey, it's been a real enlightening conversation. Thank you for your time, your service, and sharing your story today.
Thank you for having me, Alex.
That was the final episode of Season 5. Life on the Line and our video documentary series, Life After Service, will return in 2022. Make sure you're subscribed to us in your preferred podcast app, on YouTube, and on social media to know when we're back. And keep your ears peeled in December for our annual Christmas special. We're on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube at Life on the Line Podcast, on Twitter at LOTL Pod, and on LinkedIn at Thistle Productions. Our website is www.lifeonthelinepodcast.com, and our email is podcast@lifeonthelinepodcast.com. Life on the Line is brought to you by Alex Lloyd, Angus Horden, Thomas Kay, Sharon Maskell-Dare, and Rohan Viswalingam of Thistle Productions. Our artwork is by Mark Thacker of Big Cat Design. Our music is by Dan Van Werkhoven. Thank you all for listening, and lest we forget.